Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at our studios in the Air Force Association's Washington headquarters on a very historic day that the United States Navy has picked Boeing to build its version of the MQ-25A unmanned refueling aircraft. The announcement came out just a little while ago from the Navy saying the $800 million contract would go to the company for 4 of the aircraft. This is a very aggressive Navy program in order to deliver an unmanned refueling capability for the battle force within the next 6 years. The other 2 companies, General Atomics and Lockheed Martin, all eyes are on them to see whether or not they're going to protest the decision. But we thought that it's important to hear from somebody very smart on this issue, who is, at least for the moment, Commander Buzz Snodgrass, naval aviator, Naval Academy graduate, nuclear trained, MIT. You did some nuclear stuff up there, and communications director until about a month ago for Secretary Mattis. Buzz, thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, Vago, thanks for having me here. It's good to be with you.
A real pleasure. So talk to us about the importance of this award, because there are multiple, and I should also note that you've started your own company, Defense Analytics. You're the CEO of it, and you have no dog in any of these fights, but you were an F-18 pilot, so you've both carried a lot of gas to give to other aircraft. You've also done strike and fighter missions, of course, as well, about 2,700 hours in about a little more than 700 traps. Talk to us a little bit about the importance of this award for the Navy, but also for Boeing.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Vago. And thanks again for having me here. So like you mentioned, I spent 20 years in the U.S. Navy flying both the F-18, the Legacy Hornet, as well as the Super Hornet. And a significant portion of what I conducted when I was stationed in Japan was aerial refueling. So typically maybe 1 out of every 3 sorties you fly, especially as a senior pilot, was to refuel other aircraft. And when you have an aircraft carrier forward deployed around the world who's conducting peacetime or operations or operations in conflict, you find that every single aircraft is precious to the security of the United States, because any aircraft you have to take now and dedicate to a tanker role, it takes one away from a strike role or a reconnaissance role, something else you could be using it for its primary mission. So I think a couple of things. I think one, for the industrial base, this was a huge win for Boeing. Certainly it keeps them in the game. They have a lot of experience in this space. When I was a junior officer in Strike Fighter Squadron 131, we were doing some deck certification on board USS Eisenhower off of the Virginia Capes. And you had Boeing out there back in 2003, 2004 timeframe, mapping out the flight deck, taking a look at how you could do autonomous vehicles. And that was more than a decade ago. So they've taken all that experience and obviously done well with it to get this contract.
And obviously they've also invested enormously. Chris Raymond was the head of their unmanned division. He's now looking at the Embraer integration, if I recall correctly. But the company had put a lot of resources into this, and obviously this is a key lifeline, because everybody was wondering what happens after the F-18, particularly in St. Louis, where I think almost half of this work is going to be conducted. One of the things that the Navy is proud of talking about also is that this is going to be a transformational way of doing business, something that is very important. The Chief of Naval Operations, John Richardson, has talked about that. Secretary Spencer has spent a lot of time talking about it, and that's one of the reasons why Hondo Gertz, who's taken over the research, development, and acquisition role in the Navy, it has been focused on speeding acquisition cycles. So I want you to be as honest as you can. 6 years to some is not yet fast enough. But talk to us about how why the Navy is looking at this as some form of a paradigm shift for the way it goes about acquiring particularly large and complex systems like this.
Sure, and to your question, I think the Navy has a big role in this. Obviously, the MQ-25 is coming to the U.S. Navy, but when you really draw it out to the 30,000-foot level, what you realize is that this is the essence of where we're going with the 2018 National Defense Strategy. Back on January 19th, Secretary Mattis rolled that out to the American public, and part of that is a recognition that we are moving away. While terrorism will always remain the most urgent of the threats we face, especially in our current day and in the foreseeable future, you have near-peer competitors and peer competitors that really want to get aggressive in the innovation space, and especially with national defense. Markedly, you've got China and Russia. So when you think about what's going on now, we have to be able to adapt and be very resilient. We have to move very quickly with our acquisition cycles. And so that gets back to what you just mentioned, the fact that you've got Secretary Spencer, you have Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Richardson, who are very dedicated to starting to chip away to help shrink those cycles down. You kind of alluded to it. I'd say 6 years is already still too much time. I think we've seen that other peer competitors in the national security space. Other nations have shown that they can do things quicker than this, but still it's significantly less time than what we've seen with other major acquisition programs. So being able to get an unmanned aerial refueling platform to the aircraft carrier strike group within 6 years, I think is going to be a win. We still have to learn to speed that cycle up.
You were on Admiral Greenert's staff. Admiral Greenert, when he spoke of this aircraft, at the time the X-47 was doing its trials and tests and proving that unmanned aircraft could operate off a carrier deck. There was a little bit of consternation on the part of members of Congress that forced the Navy to try to keep the airplane because they were those aircraft were going to go into a museum, and there was this concern that this progress that was made was going to lapse. Admiral Greenert was always talking about sort of a multi-role platform that was stealthy, long-range, could carry munitions or could carry an ISR, intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance package. Then it became a tanker aircraft. And there are some folks who still assail the Navy and say, look, you're focused on the wrong thing. It would be great to have a tanker aircraft. What you really need is a long-range strike aircraft. 5,000 miles, 5,000 pounds, which I think is a little bit of the way sometimes Admiral Greenert and folks around him would define it. How soon before you think the Navy needs to get on that long-range strike to give the carrier battle group the longer legs, much longer legs, that it lost once, for example, the A-6 went out of service or the Vigilante went out of service, these aircraft that did have tremendous range to be able to take payload over long distances?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think what you're tapping into now is a discussion that's been going on for probably close to a decade. A mentor of mine, a guy named Captain Jerry Hendricks, now retired, had written a paper a number of years ago called What Cost for a Carrier? Great paper. I mean, he basically challenged where the aircraft carriers today, what does it bring our nation? And does it still bring 50 years after it was first brought into the Navy? Is it still bringing the same advantages? What disadvantages is it now forcing us to cope with, and especially at a very high price tag? But to your point, yeah, I think when you look at the MQ-25, I mean, the fact that you can free up those aviators, you can free up those aircraft to now take a striking role, a reconnaissance role, all the other aspects that you're going to want to play, that's one aspect of what we need. But today, to answer your question, is when we would need to have that long-range role. But I think we're getting halfway there. When you take the MQ-25, when you can free up those other aircraft, I mean, when I was in Japan as a commanding officer, and you looked at the fact that we would conduct basically clear the flight deck of all aircraft and launch everything you've got, somewhere about 25, 26 planes, to do a large force exercise. You clear the flight deck, but maybe 4 to 5 to 6 of those aircraft are dedicated to tanking. So the fact that you can now take all those aircraft, you can use them for the primary role that they were designed for is going to be fantastic and a game changer for us. And it gets back to what some people have said has been a detriment of the carrier. As we have gone to higher end platforms that are more stealthy, it requires a redesign of the aircraft itself. Now suddenly you've retreated back from the range you used to enjoy with the aircraft you mentioned. So we want to get back to where you can send the Airwing further far afoot. And I think the MQ-25 is going to get us closer to that.
I have a carrier relevance question, which we'll end on, but I want to ask you an F-35 question. On Monday, we were aboard Abe Lincoln for operational op-eval, basically, of the F-35 Charlie, the naval variant of the F-35 Lightning II fighter by Lockheed Martin. At this point, we heard from Captain Brown, commanding officer. He said, look, at this point, and we heard the same thing from Woody Horan, the Rear Admiral, who's the head of JSF integration within the Navy. Look, this is just a regular aircraft at this point. The Navy is treating it like a regular aircraft. We're trying to just get it into the system and the cycle, prepare it for its first initial operating capability, which is going to be 2021. From your standpoint, as you look at that, what kind of capabilities does the F-35C give? Because there's this perception that people have that it's a short-range aircraft. It is relatively short-range compared to a bomber, but it's got longer range, for example, than an F-18 does, even in clean guys. That doesn't include the external, sort of the beast mode, as they say, with extra payload that's hanging on the outside of the wing. Obviously, there's an enormous drag penalty on that. But talk to us a little bit about that carrier air wing of the future and what kind of capabilities it's going to deliver once also you get MQ-9 into that family to be able to reach out. It's not a stealth aircraft, but it's stealthier than something that's somewhat more slab-sided in design in terms of MQ-25. Talk to us a little bit about what that future air wing is going to look like and the capabilities it's going to be able to deliver.
Sure, great question. So I think when you talk about the Joint Strike Fighter integration that was being recently conducted, There's two aspects of that. What you saw when you were on board the aircraft carrier is blocking and tackling skills. You're taking multiple aircraft, you're putting them on a flight deck, you're forcing the flight deck crew, the personnel in the flight tower to now have to work in a totally new airframe alongside the existing legacy airframes like the Super Hornet, the Hornet, the E-2D. So you're moving them all around the flight deck. So that's one aspect of it, and that's the blocking and tackling to make sure you can operate at sea at the operational tempo we need to be relevant. The second part of that, though, are things we've been doing for over a decade now, and that is as the Joint Strike Fighter was in development, similar in some capacity to some of the other high-end aircraft, the fifth-gen aircraft we have, such as the F-22. We've been practicing some of these integration exercises for a long time. When I was a Top Gun instructor, same thing. We were doing integration exercises with the F-22 Raptor. We were making sure that on day one we could mix our forces, and we've been doing the same thing with the Joint Strike Fighter. And this is where some of this live virtual constructive simulations you've been hearing about really come in handy, because there are things you can only conduct when you're in the aircraft itself. And there's nothing that beats being in the aircraft, feeling the G-forces, understanding that you have to make those very quick snap decisions to be relevant. But when you're at 1G, when you're sitting in a simulator and you can link up a Joint Strike Fighter with a Super Hornet or a Joint Strike Fighter with an E-2 to be able to control it, you can work through a lot of these tactics and procedures that we're going to be using in real life. So I think that we've already seen a lot of the benefits that we're going to gain. It's going to be a great platform, like you mentioned. The range won't be as much as a Super Hornet that has external fuel tanks, but what it will allow us to do is be able to be in a position where it can quarterback, it can sense what's on the field and help direct the fight.
And obviously for the maintainers as well, right? Because they're getting it, they're playing with it, they're seeing how supportable the aircraft is, especially with the Alice system that's supposed to do all the predictive maintenance for it. Let me ask you a relevance of the aircraft carrier question. This is a topic that I'm astonished there is as much discussion about in naval circles. Doesn't matter whether you go up to Newport and you have the conversation, or whether or not you're talking to folks, over a beer here in D.C., including carrier aviators. So you're a carrier aviator. How do we need to look at the carrier? Because there are those, New York Times did a great story. I mean, even though for many of us who know about the whole anti-access area denial issue and the DF-21 and the DF-26 and other of the Chinese capabilities that are being developed, it was a great story to present to the American public in sort of a clear and understandable fashion what the Chinese strategy is ultimately. From your standpoint, how vulnerable is the carrier force? And ultimately, over time, what are some changes we have to make in how we think about how we use these ships, given that everything about the Chinese strategy is to ensure that I make it extremely costly for the U.S. Navy to get anywhere near my shores, whether it's from my land-based long-range missiles, whether it's holding rear bases at risk as far as Guam or Sasebo or Yokosuka, and as well seaborne weapons that really make it a very, very complicated dynamic for the Navy in anywhere near to the Chinese coast.
Well, I think when you ask that question, you talk about, is the carrier at risk? Is the carrier strike group at risk? I think it's been at risk since the 70s and 80s. I mean, we used to operate in very close formation or in the near seas with Russian forces who had fantastic anti-ship missiles that could have sunk an aircraft carrier had they chosen to do it. And I think that gets to the essence of deterrence. I mean, one, what are you using the carrier for? What's the cost to the nation to not only build it but to sustain it and maintain it in the force? But when you think about the countries you're likely to face, what is it they're really after? And that is the essence of what we have to contend with, which is deterrence. Does a nation have the credibility to use their forces, and do they have the capability to actually take the carrier out? I think there are numerous countries, or at least a couple of countries right now, that could believably take out an aircraft carrier. Now, do they have the credibility to do so at this point? I think that's unproven, as we've seen since really World War II. But there's going to be a trigger point, and I think if a nation decides that they want to actually go kinetic and challenge the carrier, they're able to do so. But when you talk about this force on force with an aircraft carrier, one thing we always leave out is that the United States is a nation, just like other nations. We have a whole wide variety of weapon systems at our disposal. Everything from non-kinetic, when you think about cyber and our indications and warnings, all the way to, of course, some of our most significant weapons in the arsenal. So where you fall on that spectrum, you have other things like space assets, and I already mentioned cyber, that you can use to help defend and protect the carrier. And it's working those all in together. Does that meet a threshold where your adversary actually decides they have enough in the fight that they actually want to try and take it kinetic?
I want to ask you a question about will to use the system. There are those who say that, when you look at an aircraft carrier, $14 billion for Ford. Obviously, it's a slightly misleading number because that's the lead ship in an entirely new class of carrier. But certainly the Nimitz class was $5 billion, 5,000 or more sailors aboard them, 60, 70 expensive aircraft that are on those ships. And that looking at it that way, given the kind of challenges that would be faced, that the United States might not be willing to risk that ship, lose that ship in order to achieve a goal, and that effectively negates the deterrent power of the carrier, where your adversary looks at it and be like, look, that's just way too dear for you, and if I sink it, you're going to lose 5,000 guys in a day, and you're just not going to want to do that. Do you think that there's a risk? Does the adversary know 100% certain that in a scrape, we will risk the ship, we will go in there if the mission is important enough?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I think in some respects, you kind of answered it at the very end, and that is, does your adversary that you're in competition with believe that you're willing to put the carrier at risk? And I think, one, when you look at how we've operated in the past and how we anticipate operating in the future, the answer is absolutely we would. You wouldn't have it in the arsenal otherwise, but I think that there's always a campaign plan that comes together. Maybe you're using long-range standoff weapons in order to roll back an enemy's defenses, so therefore the carrier can operate with more impunity, or at least you take a contested environment and you make it less contested than it once was, and you give the carrier some operating space. But I think one of the things, the golden thread that's been running through this whole conversation, we talk about, hey, 6 years to get the MQ-25 out to the fleet. Is that quick enough? When you think about the aircraft carrier itself, we're talking about, even with the MQ-25, some legacy systems. When you look at where the preponderance of evidence points us towards, drones, the fact that autonomous systems, being able to do edge computing, so all the horsepower with being able to take a platform, you network them all together. Now you can do drone swarms, swarms of drones to get after the indications and warnings or the sensing you need to be able to employ your forces. I think that's going to be the future we're going. So I think that we are probably at a tipping point right now where the carrier, because of the way it's been optimized over the course of years, you took a role from World War II and you continue to perpetuate and refine it as you move forward for another 5 decades plus. But at the same time, you think about where we're going. The carrier can still be useful in that role. You could take and outfit a lot of autonomous vehicles on this platform. It's very resilient. So American taxpayers' investment today in an aircraft carrier will still pay dividends for years and in some cases decades to come for the newest carriers that we have in service. But I think you will have to see a radical redesign and an upgrade in the carrier Airwing itself as we move forward to make sure that you're getting that return on investment.
And I think it's important to note that these 4 aircraft are delivered in 2024, but we're talking about dozens of aircraft, not hundreds or thousands of aircraft like the F-35 program. But from a speed standpoint, why is speed so relevant?
Yeah, I think the bottom line when you bring up that topic is it has to move at speed of relevance. You can't continue to invest in platforms that will take a decade to actually to realize and get to the fleet. You have to be able to move at a much quicker pace. And so when you look at what Assistant Secretary of the Navy Hondo Gertz is doing, I know he's definitely invested in that. And I think the Air Force is doing a great job as well. You look at Secretary Wilson, General Goldfein, but more importantly, you've got Dr. Will Roper, who's got the Hondo's equivalent job with the Air Force, and he came from the Strategic Capabilities Office. So you're at a very interesting inflection point right now where you have an administration that really wants to invest in rapid prototyping, experimentation, and development. You have leadership from Secretary Mattis on down to the service secretaries and, of course, into the acquisition fields. And probably just as important or more importantly, you have a congressional team on both sides of the aisle that really want to make this work. In fact, they've reached over repeatedly to Secretary Mattis and said, what else do you need? What authorities can we give you? How can we help? So I think you have this very interesting inflection point right now where you can really start to push this home, but we have to make sure we take advantage of it while we still can.
Buzz Snodgrass, today on your last active duty interview as a commander in the United States Navy, former communications director for Secretary Mattis. But most of you will see this. You retire tomorrow, so fair winds and following seas on the new venture as CEO of Defense Analytics. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great being with you. Thank you.